now get to introduce you to both Nadia and Yona again, and they will be speaking to us today about grief and loss.
Okay, so like I said, Yona and I are going to be talking with you today about grief and loss, especially within the COVID context. So we don't have any relationships with financial sponsors to disclose. And we do want to acknowledge that this program has received financial support from the Canadian Institute for Health Research, and as well as some in-kind support from CAMH. And we do not have any conflicts of interest to declare. And the information that we are presenting is evidence-based, based on peer-reviewed and scientific information. Okay, so the learning objectives for today are to understand the impact of grief and loss on people with intellectual disabilities and their communities during COVID-19, and also to understand how to support people with intellectual disabilities and their communities in coping with grief and loss during this time. Okay, so as I'm sure everyone is well aware that there's been, different types of losses during this time, the loss of our regular routines and daily activities, the inability to connect with people that we know as we would like. For some special events have been canceled, and the future does remain uncertain to a certain degree, and also many of us have experienced the death of family members and friends, whether it's due to COVID or other health conditions. Okay, so just wanting to acknowledge that, and this can be an emotional topic, so if you need to take a break, feel free to do so. We won't be offended. The slides are always there for you to look at later. And I just wanted to give us all a moment, just a brief moment, to remember the people over this year, over 2020, who have died, whether it's due to COVID or other health issues. Okay, so as we approach the end of the year, I think this topic is a little more pertinent because even if you don't celebrate Christmas or Kwanzaa or Hanukkah, I think we do tend to be a little bit more reflective at this time of year and kind of thinking about the people in our life who have died or may not be with us at this time. And our clients may also be having these similar types of thoughts and feelings. Okay, so in this slide, we're just going to go over the impact of grief on people in general, right? So grief, and in this presentation, we're focusing really on grief following the death of someone that we know, understanding that there's all sorts of losses that people do experience, but just focusing on death. So one area is emotional. So we generally have not just one emotion, but a whole tangled up ball of emotions. So whether it's anger, sadness, guilt, worry, relief, loneliness, irritability, people can experience all of these. And then psychologically, we may be kind of fuzzy, right? A little confused, maybe forgetful, kind of questioning, why did this happen? So different types of thoughts going through our heads and maybe finding it hard to focus. And then the physical changes can happen. So trouble with sleep, changes in the appetite, and some people do experience those general aches and pains. And so I always suggest to people, if they are experiencing those, definitely get a physical health checkup and make sure there isn't an actual physical cause to these concerns. And then behaviorally, you might find that people avoid others, maybe they're kind of isolating, or they may seek people out. Some clients that we support may demonstrate or have some aggression, maybe from the frustration of what's happening to them. Or other people may be more tied to their routines, and that kind of helps them cope. So whether or not you have an intellectual disability, I think people experience a range of emotions and presentations when they're grieving. And then the other dimension that isn't on this chart, but can be apparent for many people, is that spiritual dimension, right? So maybe questioning life, or why we're here, or what happens next. So that can also come up. And so it's important to remember that grief touches us all, right? So if you have the person with intellectual disability at the center, maybe it's a support staff that's died, a family member, a peer, a friend, and it kind of impacts your whole community. And it's really important to recognize, Canada is so diverse. We have people from all over the world here. We have our Indigenous communities throughout the country. So our culture, our religion, our spiritual practices from our community do affect and impact how we grieve. And so it's really important to understand that when you're supporting someone, what community do they come from, and kind of what practices are important to them. And so in this presentation, I think a lot of the ideas are from the Western perspective, but there can be other cultural traditions. So studies in the US and the UK of direct support workers have shown that when a client dies, they definitely are impacted, they're grieving, but they kind of struggle sometimes feeling that they're not able to show that in the workplace, and they want to support clients as well, but sometimes they, feel that they don't have the tools. So we're going to get to that in this presentation. So one of the things that's important for individuals to understand is the cycle of life, and what it means to be alive, and what it means to be dead or not living, in a very concrete way. So this slide kind of shows some very concrete ways of explaining that. I know many of us, even myself, use words like passed away, or someone is lost, or they've gone to rest. But when you're working with someone with an intellectual disability, it's important for you to know that they understand what death means, right? That person actually didn't go missing, they didn't really go to sleep. That these are words we use, but if someone has died, what does that actually mean? So using the right terminology. Okay, so one simple conceptual way to understand mourning, it was created by psychologist Dr. Worden, and he has like a task-based theory, right? So to accept the reality of loss, to experience the pain, adjusting to life without the person who's died, and kind of reinvesting in a new reality or building new connections. So I just want to be clear that people don't move through these phases neatly, and it's not that you have to do one and then the other. I think it just acknowledges that it's a process, right? That it's important to experience the pain, know what's happened, and then try to build out while still maybe obviously missing that person. So in terms of the COVID situation, it's definitely impacted how we grieve and how we experience the pain, as we're more isolated than we have been previously. And so I've had to change this slide a few times because our practices have been changing depending on where you're living in the country. So for example, in Ontario, at one point, there were no funerals, then there were. So I think, you know, that's been really difficult for people not to be able to comfort each other. And explaining that to people as well. Okay, so this slide just goes over some myths and reality in terms of people with intellectual disabilities and grief. So I think in the past, people felt that they could not handle it, that going to certain things like funerals would be too overwhelming, and they do not understand the concept of death. But I think research has shown the reality is grief is difficult for all of us, right? People can participate with explanations and support if they choose, because it is their choice, and they can understand definitely on an emotional level the concept of death, that someone is no longer part of their life. Okay, so here are just some really quick tips. So to be concrete, repeat information, encourage them to express their emotions, and ask what support would be helpful to them. Okay, so that's the quick tips. And now we're going to look a little bit more at some resources, and in the end of the presentation, there's lots of links that you can kind of go through. So usually for a lot of people, I like to use visuals. So there's some great books, like the Books Beyond Words series has some. You can see those there. Some people like a line drawing. Some people like the actual photos of things like coffins. So you need to know your client and what would work for them. And maybe even using some visuals of emotions to explain what people go through, or movies and stories, just to explain death and the grieving process and to normalize it, right? We all go through this. It's not a disorder. It's part of life. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it over to Yona to provide us with some more detail in terms of how to explain things and support individuals.
Thanks, Nadia. So if you're going to pick one site to explore, both Nadia and I are huge fans of Irene, who has developed this website before COVID, but a lot of her work around understanding death and just loss in general and how to have those kinds of conversations has been so valuable, I think, since the pandemic. And there's also been a number of updates and things to the website around how things are different during the pandemic. Next slide. So this is just a breaking down, and you can find this within the website, that to figure out what to say, how to say it, when to say it, you have to know a few things. You have to know how someone understands information and how they best learn it. And you also have to know about who the people are in that person's sort of circle of care and the different roles that people can play. Next slide. In figuring out sort of what to say and when to say it, it's really important to understand why the person is upset. So I think we can automatically think, for example, this person is upset because this person died. They might be upset because they didn't have their breakfast, at the table in the way they're used to, right? Or they're upset about something they can't go to. So which things we bring into the conversation have to start with knowing where they are. And specific things we do need to understand about people have to do with, in terms of like sort of concepts. Do they understand that people die? And also, do they understand the difference between now and things that happened in the past and things that will happen? And the difference between something that's happening in 2 days versus something that's happening in a year. So the concept of time is really important. And also, and this is important during COVID, if there's people you can't see, can they hold on to the idea that this person exists, but I'm not allowed to see them right now, which is different than this person exists in my mind, but I can never see them again, right? So the experience of losing someone and death, if the person can't distinguish between those two things, not being able to see mom or dad during COVID is basically the same as death, right? So sort of understanding that's really important. And then all of that will help us understand the things we can do to help them understand. Next slide. So these are two resources that are really helpful. So you'll see Irene in the picture on the left, and this was a specific webinar that was put together sort of during COVID to think about how things are different during COVID. And the image actually there is from Books Beyond Words. I don't know if you guys can see me pointing, but I keep pointing to my screen and I realize no one's here but me. And then the other link that Nadia put in is a really interesting resource with a lot of similar ideas that came out of research, not from the UK, which is where Irene's work is from, but from Australia. And it's again about this importance about talking about end of life. So really helpful tools there too. Next slide. Books Beyond Words, we already heard about from Nadia. The important thing is that a lot of the stuff is for free. And this book is a guide. So it's not so much a story that you would use to explain things to someone with a developmental disability. It's guiding you on how you might think about talking about these things during COVID. Next. So thinking about, everyone's like, oh, I don't know if I'm trained for this. You know what? I don't think any of us are trained for this. So this question is kind of getting at who is the right kind of person to have these conversations. It is helpful that it be someone that person already knows and trusts. And it's really important. You know how some of us are just not that comfortable with people being upset? We're not necessarily the best people to have these conversations, or we just need to learn to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So there isn't something we can fix. We can't stop the person from being upset, but we have to be able to make space. And the important thing here, especially for staff who work really closely with the person or family members, is that the only person set up to talk about grief is not just the grief counselor, right? They certainly have a role to play to help us all understand grief, but many of us can have some of those skills. And then the last reminder here is that how we all learn about death is an experiential and gradual thing. So I might understand that somebody died, but it hits me at the funeral, or it hits me 3 weeks later when I'm pulling out an old piece of clothing, right? So it's always changing how we understand it, and it's the very same for people with developmental disabilities. We will not get it all right. Anyone who's experienced death knows that all of us make terrible mistakes that can upset people sometimes, but we're learning, we keep going. So I think one thing, you know, Nadia and I talked about how awful it is that we do this in the last session because it's not a very off topic, but I think it's a chance for us to really all come together. This is not an issue unique to people with developmental disabilities. We all have that sense of loss, and it's something we can really share in common with the person that we're supporting. So I think that's a unifying and strengthening thing to think about. Next slide. So this was the webinar that Nadia and I were talking about just before the session. So it actually just happened this week, but they're so good. You guys got to look up PCPLD, which is the Palliative Care Network for people with learning disabilities in the UK. They do great webinars and podcasts. But in this one, they talked about this study that was done with Jane Burnell and Stuart Todd, who was at University in Wales, and Jane is from London. And they followed people who were living in different residential support services over time to see basically who died. This was pre-COVID. And they wanted to find out, you know, if how many of those deaths were kind of expected deaths and how the staff coped with it. So there's a YouTube video explaining the study, and also explaining, and it's a teary webinar, to staff reflecting on their experience of an unexpected death for someone with a developmental disability that they were supporting, one pre-COVID and one during COVID. But if we go to the next slide, I think you have a slide, Nadia, on the findings from the study. Oh no, so
no, I don't.
1 second, and I'll just tell you the findings from the study. The important thing from the study is that most deaths that happen are not that anticipated. And it really affects everyone, not just the person with the developmental disability. That person dies. People with developmental disabilities are affected by it. But us as clinicians and as staff are really affected by it. And there's lots of nice suggestions in the webinar and in the article on things we can do to help all of us cope when someone with a developmental disability dies. Back to you, Nadia.
Okay, thank you, Yona. So the next little bit is just a few tips in terms of remembering and preparing. So if you are anticipating that someone will die, there's some ways to prepare for support. So holding shared objects, listening to music, and also maybe gathering some of those keepsakes or photos for the person to have later on. So kind of planning ahead for the next time in life. So after death, these are some things that I have done with clients, and honestly, it might seem like a depressing topic, but people really enjoy having the chance to share their memories, right? Because I'm a new person, and so that's nice to learn about the person who died. So these are just some suggestions, like memory books, a memory garden for the spring anyway, cooking their favorite meal, these types of activities. And you can even do this while physically distanced. You don't need to actually be with others. So that's kind of a bonus there. And these days online, there's so many podcasts and different programs giving suggestions at this time of year. So the last slide is really about what to do if somebody needs some more support. I mean, there are diagnoses of persistent complex bereavement or prolonged grief disorder, which I won't get into. But if you're feeling that someone is kind of stuck, that they're struggling a lot to get back into any routine, it's been like 6 months, a year, then maybe it's time to get some more help, and just remembering the HELP acronym, right? So checking out their health, what else has changed in their environment. I mean, they have experienced a loss, but what else? And then finally considering, do they need some psychiatric support, right? After we've done everything and looked at everything. So to summarize, just look at your own comfort level with grief, death and dying before supporting others. You're not on your own, hopefully, so you have a team and colleagues to lean on for some support. People with intellectual disabilities, like all of us, might need a little extra help, right, to process what's happening. And like most things in life, do your best with your best intention, and people know that, right? They know that you care, and they appreciate that. Just a phone call, right? Sometimes people know that you remembered them. So,
well, just wanted to thank Erica again and Nadia and Yona for an amazing presentation. As a health provider, I've always felt it's such a privilege to be with people in this part of their life.